Hello and welcome to episode 52 of MMO Weekly presented by Chitty's Cheesesteaks. I'm your host, Sal Manzo. Along with a very special guest this week, we're joined by Sam Dykstra of MLB Pipeline to talk all things Mets Draft from last week. Sam, thank you so much for taking some time with me this week.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sal.
Absolutely. Well, obviously, we all know last week was the MLB Draft. Mets had a bunch of picks. I know there was a lot of buzz on Twitter. Mets went very pitching heavy, took a bunch of high school shortstops, what people seem to be up in arms about, which didn't really understand. I guess they don't understand the whole drafting for needs and, things like that or best available. But I just, initially we'll get into kind of a few players, in depth that the Mets took, their earlier draft picks. But I just want to get your initial reaction of how you thought the Mets did overall in their draft last week.
Yeah, I mean, you got to start at the top. And when you're drafting 32nd overall as your first pick, you get a little worried about who's going to drop there or who's going to be available to you. So them getting a high school shortstop like Colin Houck, who we had as number 12 in our MLB Pipeline top 250 rankings. You get the number 12 guy at 32nd overall. I'm sure they were doing cartwheels in that draft room. You zoom out a little bit. You talk about being pitching heavy. I think they took arms with 8 of their first 10 picks, something like that. And then going deeper, they were a little heavy on high school shortstops. But listen, that's where you got to draft. Good pitching is hard to find. So if you're trying to, bring up the pitching in the system, sometimes you just got to go for quantity over quality. And, if the right guys aren't necessarily there, if there wasn't an ace available at 32, which, let's be honest, there really never was going to be.
Sure.
You take 8 arms in your first 10 picks, you deepen your chances of at least finding somebody who can help out the future, either big league rotation or big league bullpen. So I feel like arms are harder to develop. The more lottery tickets you get, the better chances you have. So I think that's the strategy they were kind of leaning into. But talk about those shortstops. I mean, those guys are the easiest to move around because usually they're extremely athletic. So they might be shortstops now, but it's highly likely that at least some of these guys are going to move off that position pretty quick.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the initial reaction. A lot of fans and stuff online. Obviously, Lindor is going to be here for the next decade. So people, kind of little stunned, I guess, is not the right word, but I guess surprised taking that many shortstop with those picks. But, I think people need to understand that, a baseball draft is much different than any other sport, right? You look at football, you look at basketball, you can draft those top picks of positions of need, right? That can help impact your team now. MLB draft's not like that. We know that, right? Players develop, takes years, and you're not going to, the pitcher that was taken first overall this year by Pittsburgh, I think that was a rare thing that a team that had a need like that was able to take such a dynamic player, particularly a pitcher like that. It kind of lined up that way. But, in general, like you said, especially shortstops are tremendous athletes. I think Jet Williams is probably a good example of that too, who the Mets drafted last year, right? Obviously, probably not going to play shortstop at the major league level, but moving to center field, just someone in general. And I think the way baseball is, to get athletes like that, right, then it doesn't hurt to be able to play multiple positions in general, because that's, kind of the way the sport goes now, even especially for some of the higher profile players. I think McNeil's a good example of that at the big league level, but just, that's my thoughts there on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeb Williams is the perfect example. I remember talking to folks last year, like there were people really excited about the Mets getting him at that pick. I think he was a little bit slept on going into the draft, and now we're seeing him. He's a top 100 prospect for us. It's pretty much a consensus top 100 prospect in the game, but he is moving between short and center field, and those are 2 premium positions. So no matter where he lands between those 2 spots, if he can hit like he has, and I think he hit a homer earlier today too, so the power is certainly coming. Just take the best players and let them figure it out later. And often in the high school ranks, especially, you're going to put your best player at shortstop. So that's just the way it works.
And, you mentioned before, obviously, the Mets' first pick, Colin Houck. You mentioned he was on everybody's pretty much ranked 12 out of the big 250 right on the draft board. Was there a reason, is not that I don't know if there's anything you can pinpoint, why he was able to slide down to the Mets slot there? Did you hear anything that gave people kind of pause draft day? And in general, just I can't imagine how hard it is to evaluate players, even on draft day, things like that, right? Your board can change, I'd imagine, so much, even from the beginning of college baseball season to the end, right? We saw that. But I just am kind of curious how the Mets were, or how a player like that, I guess, does, kind of slide from that projection down to where the Mets were at 32.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually talking to my colleague Jim Callis, who helps run our draft content and is tweeting out bonuses left and right now. Nobody knows the draft as well as Jim, and he pointed
Right.
out, teams are kind of getting, I don't want to say scared, but they're leaning towards taking college picks recently
Right.
because you look at who is more of a sure thing. Well, somebody who's played 3 years in school and
Sure.
played in the SEC or played in the ACC or played against, other 21, 20-year-olds, even 22-year-olds,
Sure.
and proven themselves. So we can look, when we're making these lists, we're looking at future potential, and you can look at a Colin Houck and be like, all right, well, I think he's going to be this eventually, but it's going to take him 3 years to get to the point where the college guys were. And this was especially a deep draft for college guys
Okay.
because 3 years ago, what did we have? We had the 2020 draft that was limited to 5 rounds.
Right.
A lot of guys who would have been drafted and signed went to college instead. Guys like Dylan Cruz, guys like Wyatt Langford, guys like Kyle Teal, who fell to the Red Sox in the middle of the round. So I think those kind of pushed, just that depth of
Sure.
college guys pushed some of these high school guys a little further away. Because if you're looking to draft in the late first round, you could have a little bit more of a sure thing, like a Vanderbilt outfielder, if you're the Orioles, taking Enrique Bradfield Jr.
Mm-hmm.
or some of these other options. And Houck was just the victim of that. I don't think that's a reflection of who he can be long term, but we just know it's going to take a longer road for him to develop.
Sure. And, to kind of piggyback as far as what you're talking, right? You're talking about collegiate players, right? That's kind of more of the sure thing. Do you feel like over the last, I don't know, maybe 15 or so years, maybe in decade plus, that the college game has stepped up in a sense that now you're seeing a lot more college level players drafted? I don't know if I'm particularly right on that, but it always felt like growing up, college players weren't necessarily the sure or safer bet as I feel like they are now. And is that kind of a testament to just development to the college game, how it's, kind of stepped as competition has gotten better and things of that nature over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, looking at like the last decade, or even if you want to go even shorter term,
Sure.
the last 2 or 3 years, because NIL deals are a thing now.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to go the pro route to get paid,
Right.
especially if you can go to some of these schools, your LSUs, your Vandy's, your Mississippi States, these places that breathe baseball, and you can get paid pretty well. Not by the school, obviously, but get paid to be a sponsor of some local
Sure.
business, and like you'll be taken care of that way. And also, teams are investing in facilities, and we're getting more coaching opportunities
Right.
in college baseball. So the development doesn't need to start at the pro level. You can do it and really hit the ground running out of college. You can get
Mhm.
3 years of quality development there in a way that you didn't necessarily think you could 20 years ago. You certainly weren't getting paid. That was the whole point
Sure.
of NCAA. So as tide is turning there, I think a lot of guys are thinking like, hey, listen, I can go to the pro route and I can be be on the highway to the majors immediately,
Right.
or I can still get paid, develop potentially even better, jump up a few rounds, and get paid through a bigger bonus. I think that's certainly a changing dynamic in the draft.
No, it's really interesting, and I agree there. Like I said, it's felt that way the last few years. Interesting to see how developments kind of happen for that. And also, you mentioned COVID. I was wondering if are you seeing did you see any players now still feeling any effects from the pandemic, just as far as either a development standpoint or anything of that nature? Is there any still kind of COVID carryover, so to speak, for any sort of these draft eligible players? I know it's 3 years later now, but I still feel like it's probably that window for guys that were affected by it. So I was just kind of curious there.
Yeah, I don't think we're necessarily seeing it in the draft.
Okay.
I think obviously on the pro side, like
Sure.
amongst pitchers, there are certain guys who missed a year of innings. Like you can
Right.
throw in your backyard, but that's
Right.
not a competitive environment. And I think that we're still seeing it take a little bit of time, and especially the last few years, the jump from AAA to the majors has been big as
Sure.
ever because major leaguers were playing in 2020, where AAA guys, you might have been at the alt site, but chances are you weren't, again, playing in that competitive environment. I
Sure.
think that's narrowing the
Hmm.
more time we get away, and the more baseball is being played, but it still exists. I mean, the jump from AAA to the majors is as big as I can remember it, and I've been doing this for 11 years now.
Right.
It seemed like it was a little bit easier before. Now you're seeing guys take their lumps. Guys like last year, even Adley Rutschman took a while to adjust to the major leagues. But the best of the best can do it, and it just takes a little bit more time now.
Sure. And, I'm just thinking a little bit back as far as you're talking about. I keep going back to the development part. And are you seeing now? Obviously, velocity is a huge thing. We know that. But are you looking, are teams looking now maybe more at pitchers at the college level that have not logged a ton of innings under their belt, but, have a significant workload and feel like, once they are brought to the pro level, like their feet are a little wet, so to speak, with that point? I'm just kind of wondering there, there's so much emphasis on velocity and just max effort. And I'm wondering if anything's gone back to any sort of pitchability at all. Guys that, are able to a little bit more command secondary pitches, things of that nature, can go a little bit deeper in ball games. I'm just wondering if there's any, sort of shift there as far as thinking in teams that, look at players.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily happening. I mean, one of the interesting things that continues, and this has been a slow build, but we're certainly reaching a max point with this now, is the amount of data on all these guys is insane. I mean, high school guys, D2 guys, junior college guys, all of these guys, we have spin rates on now. We know your induced vertical break on your fastball. You're seeing some teams do more of a model where they're plugging all this data in and trying to figure out, okay, where do we see this guy, instead of necessarily just sitting back there with a radar gun. I think that's changing how we view guys. It's not necessarily, hey, can you get me to the 7th, 8th inning?
Sure.
Because if that were true, Stanford had Quinn Matthews, right? Who threw 156 pitches.
Yeah.
Clearly, the guy loves being out there.
Right.
And can pitch deep into games and pitch effectively. But we know his stuff is only kind of average, which can still make him like a 4th or 5th starter, but it's a longer road there. So I think the use of technology and the availability of all that data has definitely changed the way we view a lot of these guys.
So interesting the way technology has changed everything, and it's been so rapid over the last, I feel like 5 years itself. It's just been it's been a boom. But a couple of questions on top of that. Just as far as on the scouting side, right? Can you kind of tell us a little bit? Obviously it's the 2023 draft class, but can you tell us like how far back teams are scouting players? Like if it's collegiate players, are they going back all the way to high school looking at these players? These draft boards years in the making? Can you kind of, tell us a little bit about how that goes? Because I feel like it's so much more in depth than people even realize year to year.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about like perfect game events and all these types of showcases that happen for kids at a super young age. Some of which I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, sometimes I think it puts kids who are 13, 14 years old under a microscope. But to your point, even college guys like Dylan Cruz, who went number 2 this year, people knew him in the 2020 draft. They had years of research on him, years of scouting. And then he goes to LSU, and then even more people see him.
Right.
So this exists for a long time. I mean, things can change. Like a guy can start hitting 95, and we're going to talk about projectability and all that. Things can develop, of course, that's the whole point. But in terms of like, hey, this is what I used to see him doing, these are the adjustments he's made, all of these guys have tons of notes on them. It's really hard to find an uncovered gem in a draft anymore. You're not going to hide a guy like you used to be able to.
That's interesting. That just brings me to another point. I have some more specifics of a couple of guys the Mets drafted, but I guess that brings me to something I wanted to ask you too, just as far as how hard it is to evaluate this many players in a draft like baseball. Like I said, football, basketball, the impact is, if you're a higher round draft is pretty much immediate, right? There's no real, the NBA has the G League, football has practice squad, but really, you're making an impact pretty much right away. How hard is it for teams and guys like yourself, Jim Callis, just to evaluate so many players, so many, amateur players year in and year out, and to be able to, hit on, a good number of these guys to understand that they're pros. I'm just curious, like how that evaluation goes. Cause like you talked about with perfect game, there's so many different things now, players that promote themselves. I would imagine it's gotta be in the social media age, it can be pretty hard at times to sift through, the top tier talent from the rest of the pool.
Yeah, I mean, from a journalist side, like my job is not to be a scout, it's to be a gatherer of information, right? So it's talking to scouts or talking to farm directors or scouting directors, what have you, about what they've seen. Those people are the real experts.
Right.
How they go through all that is amazing to me, and it always will be, because the margins are really razor thin. I mean, the amount of guys who are touching 95 now is incredible. I mean, it used to be like once you touch 95, you were an instant prospect.
Right.
It still kind of is on the draft level, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, of guys who can do that now. It's can they command the ball well enough? Do they have a good enough slider?
Mm-hmm.
What is the shape of their slider? Is that something that can translate? Is it a little too loopy? All that kind of stuff. That's why some teams rely on models. That's why some teams rely on dozens and dozens of scouts filing as many reports as you can, and then you try to get to a consensus. You have a cross-checker. You have your scouting director who will go and check out like a top 10 pick or a first round pick to see with their own eyes whether this guy's worth it. And then you have individual workouts too. I mean, now we have the combine, which brings all these guys into one spot, but you can still have a potential first round pick come hit BP in your major league ballpark, which is always fun to hear about those stories afterwards about like, yeah, he hit 6 home runs in our major league ballpark, and that's when we knew that. There's just so many ways of breaking all these guys down, but it all comes down to getting that data, getting those eyewitness reports, and then trying to get it as. And I was saying earlier, like it's harder to find or it's harder to hide guys. It's not like they're going to be like, oh, there's this guy in Florida that nobody's seen yet.
Right.
But you can disagree. Like Shane Bieber, a lot of people saw Shane Bieber in college. Jonathan Mayo, my other colleague, wrote a book about this, about how some guys don't get seen. He was seen plenty. The guy pitched in college. But nobody other than the Guardians maybe saw like, hey, we can increase this guy's velo. He really hits the spots, but we know exactly how to get the best out of him. And that's that next level.
Absolutely. That's the coolest part to me. I think you talked about the projectability, right? And I think that's a perfect example of certain teams. I would imagine, obviously, I think the Rays of the world, they're the first that come to mind, developing their homegrown talent and evaluation, just being able to see a picture. And like you're saying that other teams maybe not necessarily aren't coveting, but looking at their metrics, certain pitches and, saying, oh, we could reshape that slider. We think we'd be better with this or the fastball. Like you're saying, it's so interesting how information is driving everything, can, help players kind of move forward. It's really cool. But another thing I just wanted to shift kind of in particular with the Mets prospects or draft picks, I should say now. Obviously, everyone's gone crazy for Shohei Ohtani. He's the best player in the world. We know that. It's awesome. The Mets did draft a two-way player, Nolan McLean from Oklahoma State. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask about him. And do you think that there's any sort of shot that he could be someone that could actually do that, on the major league level?
On the major league level, I think it's kind of stacked against him. It's just so hard to do both. Yeah. It really is. I mean, Ohtani makes it look easy, and it's just insane. Now, I think we are seeing the Ohtani trickle-down effect, and that more of these guys are actually getting the opportunity to play two ways. We were talking about this earlier on the pipeline side of like, think about Hunter Green when he was drafted. People are like, he might be an actual two-way player, and it didn't last very long. I think more guys are getting those chances. We saw like Reggie Crawford now in the Giants system, came out of UConn. He's actually playing two ways now, but that's his first year. Wow. Maybe they shelved that for year two. We'll have to see. Gotcha. Bubba Chandler in the Pirates system played two ways last year. They made him into a pitcher full-time this year. He told me in spring, like, it was a relief to know that you're only doing one thing. That way you have days of rest, where you know exactly what you're working on every day. It's not like, is today a hitting day? Is today a pitching day? But in the case of McLean, it sounds like they're going to allow him to relieve. They're going to allow him to DH. He really likes hitting. There's just so much swing and miss involved on the hitting side for him that I think it's going to be difficult. I'd rather see him be a full-time pitcher. But the power is real. I mean, when he makes contact, it's really loud pop. But he's up to 98 on the mound with above-average slider. Like, that's tough to find. And if you're doing that as well as he has, so far, I would just focus on that. But we'll see. He's getting a chance, and I think part of that is thanks to Shohei.
Absolutely. No, it's really cool. Hopefully, like you said, it's hard enough to do too. I would imagine Ohtani is somewhat of a blueprint now for players to navigate it, but it's such uncharted waters. I would imagine, right? If you can perfect one of them, the Mets would be very happy. So hopefully he could do that on the pitching side. But I do want to stick with, as far as the pitching draft picks that the Mets had. We talked about it in general, a lot of college arms we were talking about before, kind of that quantity over quality and hoping a couple of those stick. So I was just wondering more specifically who you liked out of the pitchers that the Mets drafted. It was the one, in particular that you had rated higher, you think could be, an impact pitcher down the road for them at the major league level.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of going to Brandon Sproat as their second round pick, I know that was like an instant meme on Mets Twitter in terms of like, I can't believe they took this guy again. And it's funny to think about. But you look at who he is as a pitcher, and
Mm-hmm.
if you're drafting in that second round, and they've already signed him for slot or agreed to terms for slot.
Sure.
So there's no second round of this. He's definitely going to be a Met this time. But 94 to 98 miles an hour, a mid 80s slider. He's got a workings of a curveball and a changeup. And, they seem to have something working this year with Mike Vassell. He was somebody who they've added some velo to from his college days. So they know how to develop college pitchers. Blade Tidwell still has some control questions, but is coming along at a decent clip. Sproul could be that next guy. And he could be a potential quick mover as well. So when he has that stuff, he's probably the best pitcher that they drafted.
Wow.
I don't love their entire class of pitchers, but again, he's probably the one that I think there's a clear lane to him being like a number 4.
That would be awesome. And as we know this year, the Mets are starved for pitching. It's obviously not going to be an instant impact, but any arms that could develop in the next couple of years around a guy like Mike Vassell, who you mentioned, that would be tremendous. But I want to go to Twitter, actually. We had someone, Evan O'Brien, 5220, tweeted us. We teased it a little bit earlier in the day that you were coming on the show, and for any questions that any fans had. And Evan was wondering, of the picks this year, do you think we'll make it now into the new Mets top 30 prospects ranks?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, I think Houck definitely will, Sproat definitely will, McLean definitely will. Caden Morris has a potential to do that, in the late 20s range. And I think Zach Thornton, their 5th round pick, who we had ranked 165th.
Okay.
I like that guy. I mean, he's got decent control. It's not stellar velocity. It's 89 to 90. But if you can throw strikes, and maybe they can find another, get him up to 92, 93. There's a starter's kit there too. Okay. Maybe he works his way into the 28 to 30 range, just because it's tough to find guys these days, like you were talking about earlier, who are just pitchability guys. Right. And him being a pitchability lefty certainly helps that case. So I think there's 5 at most who could make it into the top 30 right now. Maybe 4. We'll see how Thornton kind of comes about, but still, that's a pretty good addition on top of last year's draft class, which I think was pretty solid.
Awesome. Yeah. And, outside of that, obviously we know about the top picks that the Mets had, but I was just wondering on the day 3, if there were any picks that the Mets made on the third day that stuck out to you that you happened to like, on that day.
Yeah. 12th rounder, Brady Kirtner, excuse me. The Virginia Tech right-handed reliever, okay. 36 strikeouts and 25 in the 3rd innings. He's got real control problems. That's why he's a reliever. He was a reliever in college. He's going to be a reliever in the next level. 15 walks in those 25 in the 3rd innings. But the fastball gets up to 97. It's got really good ride well up in the zone, which is such a modern philosophy of pitching. If you can pitch with that fastball at the top of the zone, that's how you're going to get outs in the major leagues. So the fact that he already has that, I think, is really promising. And he's got a slider that seems to work well in 2 planes. It's got a little bit of sweep to it, so it's not like a bullet slider, but it also drops well. It almost looks like a curveball in some of the looks I've seen. Okay. So if he can pitch high in the zone with that fastball and then drop in that slider, he's going to confuse some guys and move really quick. It's just how many is he going to land in the zone, or is he going to be able to get Chase out of the zone and get some of that swing and miss? But the pieces there are at least somewhat promising, especially for a 12th rounder.
Awesome. Yeah. I like the theme of the arms. We keep them coming. We love that. Cause like I said, that's seems like that's a real need here for the team in Queens. But it's funny. You mentioned the high fastball, right? And it just got me thinking of, that's a trend now, right? A few years ago, it was the fastball down at the knees, right? Throwing hard. Now it's pitchers are, working up in the zone, especially hard. Are you seeing teams now? And I know you kind of teased that there, drafting to that sort of need of the trend of players that are, particularly pitchers, obviously, that can rotate the fastball at the top of the zone? Are you seeing teams draft for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a consideration now. I mean, the age of the sinker baller, I grew up in Massachusetts, so Derek Lowe was the perfect pitcher for that. That's just what he did. He just got ground balls. But now the more we learn about the game, it's hey, let's limit the balls in play if we can. So getting swings and misses at the top of the zone is proven to be one of the most effective ways of getting whiffs. And that comes back to that term I used before, induced vertical break. I was talking to Andrew Abbott, Cincinnati Reds rookie left-hander, earlier this spring, and he was saying anything above 16 inches is considered good. So if you can get anything above 16 inches IVB, you're in a good spot. That's a measure we have now. Guys are doing 19 to 20 inches. So you might think the ball is going to be much lower. And because the ball has that induced vertical break, it's actually higher and you're swinging below it. And if you do make contact, you're popping it straight in the air and it's an easily catchable ball. Chances are you're actually going to swing under it too. So teams are definitely seeking that now.
Sure.
You know, the game's cyclical.
Right.
Who knows if batters are going to adjust to that. And
Yep.
in 10 years, we're going back to talking about ground balls because ground balls have a low batting average on balls in play. But for now, this seems to be what teams are seeking.
That's really interesting. And last few questions for you, just as far as with the new rules in place now, are you seeing teams also draft players to take advantage of that as far as more athletic guys with some speed, contact, things of that nature? Obviously, we're seeing teams like the Rays, the Diamondbacks, kind of using, speed to their advantage and things like that. Now with the new rules, I'm just kind of curious if that's now had an impact on the draft for this year.
Yeah, I didn't see too much of that this year. I mean, you look at the guys who are taken up top.
Sure.
Dylan Cruz is like an above average runner. He's not necessarily a plus guy. He's not going to be a 40 stolen base guy unless something really changes there. Wyatt Langford isn't that guy. He actually might move to left. He's played a lot of left already for Florida. Max Clark is a plus guy. And I think Walker Jenkins can be a good runner too, but it's not like those guys were number 1 overall picks. There are definitely some fast guys in this draft, and Enrique Bradfield Jr., who I mentioned before, going to the Orioles was an interesting one because he's an 80 grade runner, and I could totally see him getting 50, 60 bags at the next level. But he wasn't a top 10 guy. I don't think we're necessarily seeing that. It's what some of the toughest stuff you can develop is hitting and pitching.
Sure.
And, the speed is good and that's great and whatever. But if you can't hit, you're not going to play. So I think that's still reflected in the draft, is that you need to be a hit first type to be considered elite in the game. But maybe in some of the later rounds, like if you're looking for a tiebreaker, hey, this guy could be a pinch runner and that means more now than anything. But other than that, I haven't seen it reflect too much at the top of the draft just yet.
Gotcha. That makes sense. It's funny you said Max Clark. The first thing I thought of, obviously, is not a Mets draft pick or anything. I think he went 3rd overall to Detroit. But he's someone that I knew of through social media. He'd come up on all my feeds the last couple of years, and was someone that I sought out to look at, but it was always content to him being put out. And I would say I think he's the perfect example of that kind of social media age athlete. Branding himself. From the highlights, obviously he looks tremendous, but I believe he's out of Indiana. But still, just someone that for the last couple of years I've known about that I don't think normally it would have been on my radar, but because of social media and him promoting himself, it's just kind of interesting that way. But last few things I want to wrap up here. Overall, I just want to know if you could give the Mets a grade on their draft this year, what you think it would be.
Yeah, if we're looking at it, I want to say B-.
Okay.
There's not much there that really excites me in terms of like, oh, they really got somebody, except for Houck. I mean, Houck getting him was the big one, and I think that's what drags that from like the C level into B-.
Gotcha.
I don't think they necessarily took any huge swings after that. There are some nice guys in there, but it seemed like a solid single of a draft if we're looking at it that way. Now they could develop these guys and make us look bad, but I think at this starting gate, there's not necessarily superstars here. They weren't designed. They weren't in a lot of spots to get superstars. But it could have been much, much worse. How it could have not dropped to 32, and then you're sitting there, really, shaking your head or scratching your head, trying to figure out who they're going to take.
Absolutely, and kind of with that turn, who would you say had the best draft out of all the teams in your opinion?
Oh, that's a good question. I know when Jim did his list, he did the Cincinnati Reds.
Gotcha.
Up there. And I do like that they got Rhett Lauder, the Wake Forest pitcher. Again, because pitching is just so hard to develop. They also got Ty Floyd out of LSU. So they got 2 guys who are proven on really good teams. And Ty Floyd had a tremendous run to the College World Series. I think he struck out 17 at one point. So I think I don't want to say like a big get at number 38, but like a solid one.
Sure.
But yeah, the Reds had a very solid draft, getting Sammy Stafura, another New York guy, high school shortstop, as their 3rd pick. I like a lot of what they did there, and it's a good time to be a Reds fan too.
Absolutely.
What we already see at the major league level, and if they're replenishing the bottom of the system with these guys, they're in a good spot.
Yeah, definitely right. They're an exciting young team. And if they got more exciting young talent, good for them. But that's we're not going to keep you here all night. This was so much fun. We really appreciate it. Learned a lot tonight with you. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see a lot of these future Mets coming up here, making an impact on the big league level. Between now and then, though, again, thank you so much for coming on, Sam, and everybody. We'll catch you next week with all the latest in Mets land. So until then, let's go Mets.